In this second lesson, we're going to be talking about the difference between the voice that you're hearing. Is it your voice, or is it God's voice, or is it the voice of the enemy? So stay tuned, because at the end of this lesson, you're going to have an increased confidence recognizing whose voice you're hearing on the inside. You know how there's some times when you're not quite sure whose voice you're hearing because you're really trying to practice hearing God's voice, but then you get confused and you wonder, is that me or is that God? Well, after this lesson, you're going to learn a whole lot more about that. So let's take a look at how do we know whose voice we're hearing. So take a look at this image that I created with a friend of mine. So this house right here is like the house, your heart, that is the home of the Holy Spirit. So whenever you think things, it's going to be on the middle, and we're going to imagine God's voice to be right here, and then the enemy's voice to be right here. Okay, and notice these two doors, because we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Now, your voice is kind of like a computer. It's like a data processing center. And so when you have your voice, it's often taking in information and making a conclusion. For example, today it's very comfortable in my home, but if I go outside to work in my backyard or to hang out in the front yard, I know I'm going to get kind of chilly because it's kind of a chilly day today where I'm at. And so for me, I might think, I know what the weather's going to be like, so I probably don't want to wear short sleeves or sleeveless, but I might want to wear long sleeves, but I might get hot, so maybe I should wear a short sleeve and then a jacket. And so, yep, that sounds like a good decision. And so that's what my voice sounds like. I am going to be taking in information and making a conclusion. For example, let's say that's a negative thing, right? Sometimes we have negative conclusions. Let's say that we go to school, we're working on math, we get a bad grade on math, and we think we have this information, oh man, I made one bad grade on math, so therefore I'm not smart. You see how we take in information, the facts, like, well, I did good on this one, but here the last test I got or last quiz I got, I did a bad grade, so therefore I must not be very smart, or I must not be very good at math because it's a little harder for me. So we can take in lots of different information and make a conclusion. Now, that conclusion can either be positive or negative, and we really need to pay attention to the thoughts that go in our head. And so as we talk more, you're going to recognize whose voice and whose conclusions you're listening to and whose conclusions you're coming to agreement on. Now, let's talk about God's voice. For the most part, I like to use these onomatopoeias to describe the different voice that we hear. So you're kind of like, so you're thinking about different things and trying to come to a conclusion, because we know it's already natural that life has meaning because we like to have conclusions. That's why when we're reading a good book or watching a good TV show, we have to know what happens at the end, or maybe it's a cliffhanger and you want to find out what happens in the next series, or in the next book, the next movie. So this is an example of the onomatopoeias that describe how God's voice sounds. So the first one is, that right there is like this little girl in the top left, like that feeling that you get when it's bringing in comfort and reassurance and you feel loved and proud of yourself. Like, man, I did really good on that science project. I did really good on cleaning up my room. I'm so proud. Now, that's a good thing. God's voice, whenever you hear him, he makes you feel really good about yourself. Now, when we hear God's voice, sometimes it's like, oh, so this means conviction. Conviction is this godly sorrow that the Bible talks about. And basically, it's like you do something wrong, but you get corrected, but you also are motivated to make it right. So you're like, ooh, I shouldn't have said that to my brother, but I better go apologize and make that right. Oh, I didn't mean to do that to my friend, or whatever it may be. But you feel motivated to make it right. Like you want to make it right. And so you know the difference between right and wrong, and you're like, oops. That's kind of what that is. So when God's voice, he wants good things for you. So he'll correct you and say, hey, that's not okay. You shouldn't do that. And so he wants to teach you right and wrong. And so when he speaks, sometimes you'll have that kind of a feeling on the inside. Now, another way that we experience God's voice is like, whoa. This is where we have a big word called revelation. It's where we have this information or wisdom that comes from God only. And it's like this thoughts that you have that you never could have thought of before by yourself. So sometimes God speaks to us and we're like, whoa, that's really big. So there's one time I was like, Lord, I'm not feeling very loved. Can you remind me how much you love me? And he spoke to me about some things in my heart and even through a dream. And I was like, oh, I feel so loved, God. Thank you so much. And then there's another time where he's like, Diana, you shouldn't do that. And I'm like, I know, I'm sorry. I better go apologize and make that right. Or he'll tell me some other things and I'm like, wow, God, that is brilliant. I never thought about that before. So here are some of the ways that when God speaks, you can recognize, oh yeah, I know whose voice that is. Now, we have these different thoughts and conclusions. So if we have a thought that it sounds like it's God's thoughts, sometimes we're like, well, is that me or is that God? You ever have those moments where you're not quite sure? Think about it this way. So let's say I watched a movie with my daughters and we watched the Dora movie, which I actually really liked that movie a whole lot. And so we were both, or not we both, but me and my two daughters we were all like, this is a great movie. Now, if someone were to ask me, well, whose opinion is it? I would say, well, it's all of ours. So sometimes we agree with what God says. That's like opening up this door right here that connects his thoughts to our thoughts. And when we make an agreement, it's bringing his thoughts in. And so if someone asks you, is that God speaking to you or you? It could be both if you made an agreement with what God had to say. And so that's what's happening right over here. And the more we renew our mind and have God's thoughts, we actually feel a whole lot better because our emotions come from the thoughts that we have. So if you don't like feeling a lot of sad, a lot of mad, a lot of worry, it could be that you have a whole lot of mad, sad, and worry thoughts. And so we want to take a look at that, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Now, the voice of the enemy, right? So we're talking about the devil, we're talking about Satan. Here's how his voice is. His voice are these onomatopoeias like, So you can kind of see a picture of that girl right there with her arms crossed. So when you hear him talk to you, he makes you mad at other people. He makes you frustrated. He makes you disappointed at situations where you're offended and this isn't good enough. It's not fair. Those are the kind of feelings that you're having. Then it's because you're probably listening to the voice of the enemy. It's a good chance of it. Not always, but it's a pretty good chance of it. Now, he also can leave you angry, sad, unloved, scared. Here, this kid right here is like, oh, it makes you feel bad about who you are, maybe even. So there's another word we didn't talk about. So just like we were talking about God's voice, where you have like, oh man, it's like conviction or correction. Well, on the opposite, what the enemy does is there's a word called condemnation or worldly sorrow. It's where you did something wrong, therefore you feel bad for it. And you don't necessarily want to make it right. You just feel like you're a terrible person. Like, oh man, I totally forgot to do my chores. I'm a terrible person. I'm not a good kid. No one loves me. I make mistakes all the time. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart. I can't do this. So anytime you feel that way, that's actually not coming from God. That's coming from the enemy. So we want to take care of those thoughts. Now, sometimes the enemy actually might make you feel good, but it's a bad kind of pride. There's a good kind of pride, and then there's a bad kind of pride. The bad kind of pride is when you feel good about yourself, but you feel like you're better than other people. See, God doesn't compare you where he's like, makes you feel like you have to put down other people just to make you feel really good. So if you're like, I'm better at this and you're terrible. So you might feel good about yourself, but that's not God's voice because he loves everyone. So when we look at this, so you have thoughts that may have come in from the enemy's voice. And so if you've made an agreement with what he thinks and you think, therefore, I'm a terrible friend, no one likes me, then what we need to do is this picture right here. So if you notice this picture, it's a parent and a child, and they have gloves on. Well, what are they doing? They're cleaning. They're cleaning the house. In fact, we have to clean our house. We live in this house and the homes that we live in, and we got to keep it clean. So it gets messy because we live in it, and we just, sometimes we pick up more dirt and things and bring it in the house. And the same is true for our heart. Sometimes as we go about life, like we pick up some dirt, so to speak. Like when things happen that discourage you, someone doesn't want to play with you or hang out with you, you feel really discouraged. And you kind of have to check out your heart every now and then, the home, right, of the Holy Spirit. When you become a Christian, that's the home where God goes into, that living spirit. And so we want to keep it clean and tidy and nice and neat, right? So we need to check our thoughts and check our heart and our motivations because God examines the heart. The heart is one of the most valuable treasures that you have. So, so important. So you want to guard your heart for all of life's issues flow through it. So that's kind of a big deal is what the Lord's saying. And so as you are taking care of your heart, only you know what's going on in your heart and in your mind. Now, parents are really good at helping you and kind of picking up some things, but they can't force you to take care of your heart. They can help you. So if you are struggling with like big sads, worries, or mads, or something like that, where you're having a hard time, it's very important you tell a grown-up that you trust, a grandparent or your parents or whoever that is someone you trust, a teacher, something like that, who can help you with those problems. So what happens is, parents have to do it too, by the way. Grown-ups, kids, big kids, we all have to take care of our thoughts and feelings. But we can work alongside one another as we're doing life. So if you think about it, let's say you had a thought and you thought, I'm a bad person. No one likes me. I always make mistakes. So you agreed, you had conclusions, you took in information, right? That's how your thoughts are. You're like, oh, I messed up a whole bunch of times this week and I got in trouble a lot, so therefore I'm a bad person. So you agreed with the enemy. So here's what's interesting. So that those kind of bad thoughts come in, and then what's really cool is you can break that agreement, and that's how you clean that house, right? So you're going to say, you know what? That's not true. I may have made mistakes this week, but I am not a mistake. I am actually very loved. I'm just still learning. So you're going to take that, you say, I disagree with that, you break it, and that's how you clean it out of the house of your head and your heart, and then you agree. You have to replace it with something healthy and true, and so then you agree with what God says. And so maybe your thoughts are like, that's not true. Yes, I did make mistakes, but I'm still learning, and I just have to keep working on my mads and sads, or whatever that conclusion is that God is leading you to, because He is truth. And so we want to agree with what truth says. The enemy is the father of lies, so he can really trick us into believing some really kind of wild things. And so that's how you keep a really good heart. And so we're talking about your heart, we're talking about your thoughts, your feelings, your decisions, all of those kinds of things. I hope that after this lesson, you now feel more confident in recognizing the voice of God, the voice of the enemy, and your voice. If you're not quite sure still, guess what? What you can do is test it out with love. Does this draw me closer to loving God? And does it draw me closer to loving people? And then you check out, what does Jesus do? Based on who I know Jesus to be, does that sound like Jesus? And so that's going to help you out to know, okay, I'm pretty confident that that's the Lord speaking to me. And the more you practice hanging out with the Lord, you just kind of do it on a regular basis, you're going to get to know Him better and really know His heart and hear Him way more clearly. Just as you're getting to know a friend, you don't know them very well if you've only hang out with them once or twice or a few times, but not very much. So the more you hang out with someone, the more you think like them, the more you enjoy their company, the more you can understand their heart, and you can even kind of fill in the blank of what they would be saying and finish each other's thoughts. So it's kind of like that. The more you spend time with the Lord, it's just a relationship, a friendship. So keep doing that and practicing hearing God's voice. If you like this video, I encourage you to go to godspeakstochildren.com, where we host a live webinar, and I visit with all the families on there where parents are joining their children, and we're talking about recognizing the ways that God speaks, and then learning how to take those thoughts that are negative and then remove it and replace it with healthy thoughts. So if you need some help as a family to work on those kinds of thoughts with your kids, I invite you to go to godspeakstochildren.com and sign up for our live interactive webinar. It's unlike anything else out there, and it's equipping children to understand how God speaks to them and use it in their everyday life.